Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a dive that is, well, maybe more fundamental and more challenging than any we've done before.
I think that's fair to say.
We're wrestling with the single non-negotiable certainty of human existence mortality, but we are doing it not to find comfort, but to find clarity. We're using the heavy, demanding lens of Fyodor Dostoevsky.
That's absolutely right. I mean, when most people come to existential philosophy, they're looking for a solution.
Right.
A roadmap to happiness, maybe a comforting story about meaning.
Yeah, a kind of instruction manual.
Exactly. Dostoevsky offers none of that. Our sources, which are this deep philosophical analysis of his core ideas, they force us to start the conversation not with life, but with death.
And the moment he introduces death, it instantly changes the geometry of your life. It's not really about fear or panic, but about a radical restructuring. Our mission in this deep dive is to analyze his core premise. If death is the single certainty, the crucial question shifts entirely. It's no longer how do I avoid dying, but something more like around what truth are we organizing our lives right now?
And we're going to examine why postponing that ultimate truth makes everything we're currently pursuing, our careers, our projects, our social identity, not necessarily bad, but deeply suspicious and fundamentally fragile.
Okay.
We're here to unpack why, as Dostoevsky saw it, the most serious parts of our lives often function as the most effective ways to evade reality.
So get ready for a conversation that, well, it forces you to examine the structural integrity of your own existence. Let's unpack Dostoevsky's starting point, because it's brutal, but it's also beautifully simple. The sources define death not as a possibility, not a statistical risk we can manage.
Right, not another variable in the spreadsheet.
Exactly. It's the single, non-negotiable certainty that underpins the entire fragile structure of life. It requires no proof, no study, no debate. It's the one guaranteed appointment we all have.
And that certainty is so powerful because of its absolute indifference. I mean, death doesn't require reason or fairness or moral judgment.
It doesn't care if you are a good person.
It doesn't wait for you to be ready or successful or good. It simply is.
Yeah.
Whether you lived a saintly life or a wretched one, whether you completed your goals or failed them, the ultimate outcome, the end of life, it remains unchanged.
Right.
That absolute cold indifference, Dostoevsky argues, is the most truthful foundation you could possibly build a life on.
And it's this indifferent certainty that he uses as a kind of corrosive agent against all our familiar, comfortable pursuits. He doesn't need a grand argument. He just needs to hold up the mirror of mortality and ask a few simple questions that make the foundations of our common goals just crumble.
Think about the pursuit of legacy, for example.
Okay.
Why strive for immense fame if the people who remember you will also eventually die and be forgotten? I mean, human memory is finite. History itself is finite.
Or what about the constant quest for power or control?
Right. Why pursue absolute authority if the very physical body that carries that power will inevitably fail, betraying your will? He suggests these goals are based on an illusion of infinite time or some kind of ultimate permanence.
And this extends so deeply into the modern quest for optimization and absolute safety. We spend immense energy, spiritual and physical, striving for total security, financial security, health security, safety. But Dostoevsky just points out that no life, however optimized, is guaranteed. You can't hedge against the ultimate certainty.
People don't live by philosophy, they live by stories. Stories that are just strong enough to help them temporarily forget the central inconvenient truth. He saw that we build these incredibly intricate structures, work routines, duties, responsibilities, mortgages, these complex plans for later.
Right, the whole societal machine.
The entire mechanism, our economy, our culture, our habits, it functions perfectly well only as long as death is kept at a safe, theoretical distance.
The sources call this ordered forgetting. I love that phrase. It's not outright denial.
No, it's more sophisticated than that.
It's a psychological framework designed to maintain stability by just indefinitely postponing the central question. It lets us function by creating a kind of collective agreement that the end is too far off to matter today.
And it works until it doesn't. Dostoevsky is so interested in that moment of the fracture.
The crack in the wall.
Yes. Maybe it's a medical diagnosis, a major accident, or the sudden brutal loss of someone that shatters the illusion of time. In that specific moment, the panicked question that erupts is never, did I accumulate enough pleasure? Or did I get enough approval?
The question always reverts to, what did I live for?
Exactly. And the profound silence that follows is the key. Because in that moment, all the external supports just fall away.
Right.
The morality you borrowed from society, the I did what I was supposed to do, it goes silent. Your family, your friends, however much they love you, they can't answer that question for you.
And if your religion was just habit, just
Okay.
ritual.
It offers no immediate solace.
Yeah.
It is just you and the stark reality.
So the powerful insight here is that society and all its rules, it's really designed for the healthy. It has no answer for the dying.
It has nothing.
Dostoevsky suggests the real danger isn't the physical fact of death, but the likelihood that we've organized our entire existence around things, goals, duties, relationships that were simply not strong enough to stand before death.
They were too temporary, too dependent on what other people thought, just too fragile to sustain us when the structure finally failed.
And this reveals his ultimate uncomfortable demand. He isn't pushing for abstract happiness or simple morality. He's asking something deeper.
Much deeper.
Are we living as if we are immortal, constantly postponing the important decisions until later? Or are we living as if every single day carries its own inherent moral and existential weight?
He saw that the majority choose the first path, not out of laziness, but because facing mortality would require them to immediately abandon their current, comfortable, and ultimately fragile reasons for their life choices.
Living truly, in his view, means stopping the self-deception that tomorrow will provide better conditions for authenticity. The fear is that the life we are living right now cannot be justified to a witness who sees nothing but the truth. Okay, so if the certainty of death crushes our existing structures, Dostoevsky then meticulously tracks the 4 psychological safety nets we instinctively run to. We successfully manage to live with this knowledge, not by denying it rationally.
Right, it's not a logical denial.
It's by creating intense habits that just push it to the periphery. We postpone its relevance indefinitely. So let's get surgical now and unpack those human reflexes.
We call these the venerable pillars of avoidance, things that seem necessary, ethical, respectable on the surface, but which Dostoevsky saw as instruments of evasion.
And the core warning is that essential, good things, work, morality, family, they become distorted the moment they stop being ways of living and become a desperate way to run from death. The first pillar, and maybe the most powerful one in our modern world, is work and busyness. People rush into constant activity, not just for income, but to avoid the deep silence that forces the question, if I stop, who am I?
Busyness becomes a spiritual anesthetic. That's a great way to put it. It doesn't heal the underlying existential wound. It just administers a steady, powerful sedative.
And Dostoevsky was fascinated by the bureaucratic mind, wasn't he?
Obsessed with it. These characters, in his shorter works, they were extremely responsible, precise, utterly serious about their duties, pillars of the social order. Yet, when forced to confront a personal crisis, they just collapsed into confusion and panic. And you have to ask why. Because their extreme commitment wasn't a free, conscious choice toward meaning. It was a mechanism of avoidance.
So the frenzy around the work was the real point.
The frenzy was the evasion, a way to ensure their minds were always occupied with procedure, detail, obligation, leaving no room for the ultimate question.
But wait, I have to challenge that a little. Surely Dostoevsky knows that modern society needs diligence and work. Is he just advocating for irresponsible, chaotic living? If you need to feed your family, isn't work just necessary?
And that is the essential distinction. Work is necessary. The avoidance is the problem. He isn't criticizing the necessity of this job. He's criticizing the spiritual posture of the person doing the job. If you use work as a shield way to outsource your identity so you never have to sit still and ask what you truly believe or fear, then the work has betrayed you.
So it's the difference between working for a goal and working to forget a dilemma.
Exactly. The bureaucrat is busy, but they are hiding in that busyness.
That makes sense. Okay, the second pillar is the borrowed moral identity. This is where we tell ourselves, I live right, I follow the rules, I am a good person because society says I am. This is super effective at providing a sense of security.
Yes, but Dostoevsky is ruthless with this. If death comes tomorrow, are the standards you borrowed from your local culture or the newspaper or the current social fad, are they enough to prevent regret?
Probably not.
Morality that isn't forged in a personal confrontation with death, morality that isn't lived out of a free, conscious, painful personal choice, it just collapses. It's a convenient mask of respectability. It falls away because it doesn't belong to you. It belonged to the structure you were trying to fit into.
That distinction is so crucial. It's the difference between doing good because it feels necessary and doing good because you have stared into the void and chosen that action freely, regardless of reward or punishment.
Precisely. Now, the third pillar, collective meaning. This is seeking your identity in something greater than oneself, a nation, a political ideology, a great cause.
Right.
This lets your individual life feel significant, part of a long story that goes beyond your physical body.
And Dostoevsky was deeply skeptical of this kind of comfort, especially given his own political experiences. He was wary because collective ideals are so often exploited to avoid individual emptiness. People sacrifice everything, but they never truly ask if that dedication was a free, singular choice or just a desperate attempt to avoid the solitude of self-confrontation.
A collective ideal can't stand beside you on your deathbed.
It can't answer your fear. Only the relationship between you and your own soul and the authenticity of the life you actually lived, that's all that remains.
Okay, so we've used work, borrowed morality, grand narratives. The final, and I think you could argue most potent, reflex today is distraction and entertainment.
Oh, absolutely.
The logic is simple. If silence allows the voice of death to speak, then constant, overwhelming noise is necessary for survival.
This is prolonging oblivion, not living. Dostoevsky saw this reflex even in his time, but can you imagine how he would view our hyper-connected reality?
It's terrifying to think about. We fill every void scrolling, streaming, optimizing our leisure time, constantly seeking input. The moment the mind is empty, the difficult question surfaces. So the mission becomes to keep the mind perpetually saturated. It is a reasonable life, a recognized life, but it is fundamentally fragile.
The fatal flaw uniting all these strategies, work, morality, ideals, noise, is that they enable social survival but actively prevent the essential, authentic life. They create a facade that looks serious, but which is guaranteed to shatter.
That's the heavy, non-comforting punchline. Dostoevsky's demand for reorientation isn't about abandoning your family or career. It's about checking the motive. None of these things should be the ultimate center of your existence if they can't withstand the gaze of death.
Because anything that fails that test will betray you at your weakest moment.
Right. People don't run from death through irresponsibility. They run through the relentless, serious structures they build to avoid sitting in silence.
This analysis takes us to a fascinating and I think deeply modern psychological insight. If we successfully marginalize death, if we push it out of the center using busyness and borrowed meaning, we invariably replace that center with a substitute. And Dostoevsky notes that substitute is rarely love or truth or courage. It is almost always control.
Control becomes the new gravitational force of the individual's universe.
Yeah.
We see this in so many ways. Obsessive control of the body, biohacking, extreme diets to fight back the physical decay that signals mortality.
Right. Or control of circumstances through detailed long-range financial and life planning. Control of our self-image. And ultimately, this massive, comforting illusion that we can control the future.
And death doesn't disappear when it's marginalized. It transforms into a silent, existential threat against which we have to build these increasingly elaborate defense systems.
I feel personally attacked by Dostoevsky here. Every morning I'm trying to optimize my coffee and my workout, my calendar, just to feel safe. Is he saying my commitment to spreadsheets is just a spiritual distraction?
He would argue the intent is the key. Are you organizing your spreadsheet to be an effective participant in life? Or are you organizing it to achieve an impossible emotional state, a state of fearlessness?
That's a great question.
He describes these characters who are obsessed with rigid structure, discipline, rules that permit no deviation. They are outwardly successful, maybe even lauded as highly disciplined, but they are profoundly fragile on the inside.
Because control only functions as a philosophical center if death is treated as an accident.
Exactly, something that can be mitigated or hedged against or prevented by enough effort.
But if death is a certainty,
then every measure of control, every optimized plan, every meticulously crafted self-image has a fixed expiration date. This is Dostoevsky's sharp question. If everything you build, your career, your portfolio, your perfect physical health, can be wiped out by one unpredictable event, are you living for lasting, transcendent values, or are you just striving for a temporary, fleeting feeling of stability and fearlessness?
and the modern world is constantly reinforcing the illusion that we can win this control game. We're bombarded with methods of optimization, detailed planning, technological prevention. The actual goal is never to stop death, but simply to forget it long enough to feel stable.
And stability becomes the new god. When control takes center stage, all our values get inverted and rearranged around a single axis, the avoidance of instability.
So happiness stops being some profound state of being and it just becomes mere stability.
Freedom is reduced to safety, the ability to move without risk.
And meaning is traded in for sheer convenience.
It's the betrayal of depth, a life organized solely to avoid suffering or instability, a life that always chooses the reasonable path. It lacks the spiritual strength to endure truth.
So those individuals avoid mistakes, conflict, deep commitment, irrevocable choices.
Yes, they live long, they live stably, and they die empty because they never live deeply.
They chose the easy, safe, socially recognized path, but they ended up losing their own life in the process.
And that is the central tragedy. The deepest failure isn't death arriving early. It's death arriving precisely when the person realizes in their final moments that their entire existence was a defensive fortress built around a core of emptiness. The control has collapsed, and there is nothing underneath it left to stand on.
Dostoevsky isn't telling us to abandon our plans. He is warning that any life that prioritizes the illusion of control over the pursuit of authentic meaning is just unknowingly preparing for a spiritual collapse.
When the defensive structure of optimization fails and control proves impossible, what truth do you have left to stand on? The reality is control always fails before the certainty of death.
So we've established what the center cannot be. Not control, not safety, not borrowed morality. If Dostoevsky is suspicious of quick answers, then what's left? What remains?
The sources point towards something much harder.
Okay.
The single thing that can stand before death is not what helps you avoid pain, but what makes that pain meaningful.
And this is the introduction of individual existential responsibility.
Yes. And this is not the social contract kind of responsibility, paying your debts, fulfilling your professional duties. This is the weight of a person for how they fundamentally exist.
And it rests entirely on accepting one truth. No one else can live or die in your place.
That acceptance is transformative because it instantly strips away all the comforting excuses we rely on.
You can no longer hide behind society forced me, or the economy pressured me, or circumstance didn't give me a fair choice.
Dostoevsky acknowledges those forces exist, but he vehemently insists that external pressure does not and cannot absolve you of the internal responsibility for your soul and your ultimate choices.
It creates a moment of immense gravity.
It really does. If the circumstance exists, you are still responsible for your response to that circumstance. A life centered on this concept is profoundly uncomfortable. It offers no promise of doing the right thing by majority standards because society standards are temporary and borrowed. Instead, it demands continuous, difficult self-interrogation. Am I choosing this path because it is true to my deepest self? Or am I just living out a pre-written, easy-to-digest script provided by my culture?
I can see why Dostoevsky describes people who dare to live with this question as pained but clear-minded. They aren't necessarily happy in the conventional surface-level sense,
Not at all.
but they possess a core resilience, an internal coherence that means they are not empty. Their daily existence carries an intrinsic, self-imposed moral weight.
They live not primarily to postpone or avoid death, but to preempt the possibility of crushing regret over how they existed. They recognize that every choice is an affirmation of their life's structure.
And this brings up a common philosophical misunderstanding. A lot of critics of existential thought claim this focus on the individual is inherently selfish. But Dostoevsky argued the opposite, didn't he?
He argued that existential responsibility is the absolute prerequisite for authentic love or work or sacrifice. You can only truly and purely love others when you fully own your own existence. If you use love as a desperate flight from your own emptiness, or as a grab for external identity, I am X's spouse, I am a caregiver, then the love is tainted by need and avoidance.
But when you act from a place of free choice,
Your motives are purified. You are giving yourself to the world because you choose to, not because you need the definition it provides.
this places a really harsh metric on our daily lives, the silent test. Every action, every word, every silence is placed before the unspoken question. If this is the part of life I must carry with me to the end, do I accept it?
And the power of that test is seeing how many trivial or evasive ambitions, relationships, and achievements reveal their emptiness when you scrutinize them that way.
It must be a painful process.
It is, but Dostoevsky views it not as loss, but as profound spiritual purification. You are shedding the things that are too weak to matter.
So a life organized around death is ultimately not gloomy or morbid, it is intensely distilled.
Exactly. It has jettisoned everything that cannot withstand the truth. That individual doesn't need to live a life of high volume or frantic experience. They need to live truly true to their choices, true to their motives, and even true to their unavoidable fears.
only that raw, unadorned truth, Dostoevsky insists, can stand firm when all external structures and social conventions crumble.
If death is the ultimate certainty, the center of life must be the only thing strong enough not to dissolve under its gaze. The freedom inherent in your individual existential responsibility.
This is the section where Dostoevsky really earns his reputation for difficulty. He never promises ease or tranquility for those who live authentically. In fact, he pretty much guarantees the opposite.
He does. A life of existential responsibility is inherently painful because, having taken ownership, you have nowhere left to hide your motives or your failures.
When you accept that weight, every choice just. It escalates in seriousness. The stakes increase exponentially.
There are no more just letting things slide moments. There are no more harmless mistakes covered by the belief that someone else will fix them later.
Every action now has to pass the Dostoevsky test. If I must take complete, singular responsibility for this, dare I commit to it?
And this is where the constant daily pain comes from. Because so much of what we do, from professional compromises to small acts of passive cowardice, is propped up by moral ambiguity. We cling to those convenient exits. The market demanded it. I was only following orders. Everyone does it.
Right.
When you close those exits, you are forced into confrontation with your true self. This is the unavoidable discovery of complicity.
The profound, agonizing realization that you aren't just a passive victim of circumstance.
But an active co-conspirator in your own mediocrity, your own procrastination, your own cowardice. You didn't have to live small. You chose to live small because it was safe.
Wow.
That realization is what generates existential guilt, and Dostoevsky saw it as a kind of spiritual gift.
Okay, let's clarify this concept of existential guilt. It's easily confused with regular regret or shame. How does he define it?
It is not the guilt you feel over breaking a social rule or a legal code. It is the inner torment that arises from living below your capacity for freedom.
So you regret the failure to live authentically?
Yes, the moments you chose safety over truth, not the failure to follow an external command. It is the guilt of knowing you possess the freedom to choose, and yet you chose the easy lie.
And why is this considered a sign of a true, deep life?
Because Dostoevsky suggests that only those who dare to take responsibility for their lives are capable of truly feeling it. If you continually blame circumstances, if you live as a victim, you only feel injustice or bitterness. You rarely feel deep transformative guilt.
So existential guilt is meant to awaken you.
It's a constant reminder that every wasted day carries immense weight because once lived, it cannot be recovered or redone. It is the sting of lost freedom.
Beyond this guilt, there's the unavoidable internal conflict. The authentic self, the one that has chosen responsibility, rarely aligns perfectly with the self that wants to be loved and accepted and safe.
Dostoevsky was a master of depicting this tearing. He dismissed the shallow notion that you can perfectly reconcile the needs of your soul with the demands of society. You have to live in that tension.
And this is what forces a person into the solitude of the gray zone. You aren't extreme enough to be a revolutionary hero, but you aren't compliant enough to be obedient and comfortable.
And that solitude is the unavoidable price of existential freedom. It's the difficulty of having a conscience that belongs only to you, not to the crowd.
And many people can't bear this mix of pain, conflict, and guilt.
It is fundamentally exhausting to live with constant self-interrogation. This is the moment most people retreat. They rush back to the safety of control, collective narratives, and borrowed identities because the burden of truth just feels too heavy.
So the warning he leaves us with is this: a life that is meticulously organized to avoid existential pain, a life that rushes back into the arms of control, will inevitably lack the strength to endure death.
Death doesn't care how comfortable you were.
It only asks, how truly did you live? Pain, conflict, and guilt are not signs of a failed life. They are the necessary signs of a life that has placed itself before the gaze of death and consciously refused to look away. That brings us to the application. After all this heavy philosophical realization, how does one translate this existential weight into the mundane, repetitive rhythm of daily life?
Right. And Dostoevsky warns against romanticizing death or treating it like a morbid obsession. The goal is clarity, not despair or fanaticism. It is simply about stopping the arrangement of life as if you have infinite time to correct your current errors.
So the shift begins in our relationship with time itself.
A person who accepts death as a certainty is neither frantic, they don't feel they must consume every possible experience immediately, nor are they prone to indefinite postponement.
They don't have to do everything.
But they stop doing meaningless things for too long.
We so often confuse being alive with being busy. The modern person is constantly active, but Dostoevsky would suggest that constant, frantic activity without focus or rooted meaning is a silent form of spiritual self-destruction.
So the first practical step is focusing your energy by reducing the number of things not worth dying for.
Which doesn't mean quitting your career.
Not at all. It means preventing trivialities, petty grudges, unnecessary worries, digital distractions, minor social anxieties from consuming the limited spiritual energy you have. A responsible person works, but they know exactly why they work. They don't use the job to evade emptiness, and they don't use their responsibilities to delay their courage. They act from choice.
And this clarity is vital for relationships. When death is certain, every interaction, particularly with those closest to you, carries a kind of final weight.
Not tragically, but honestly. You can't indefinitely postpone difficult conversations or harbor grudges based on trivial things because the window for repair is fragile and unknown.
A person living soberly avoids saying things they would be unable to bear if those were their last words to another person.
They seek radical honesty over easy pleasantries because they do not want to carry false or unfinished relationships into the final stretch. This willingness to be truthful, even if it's uncomfortable, is a profound commitment to existential responsibility in the domestic sphere.
And here's the core Dostoevsky rule for structuring the day-to-day. No justification by future.
This is huge.
You cannot use promises about the future to excuse the moral, spiritual, or existential compromises you're making in the present moment.
It will be different later.
Yeah.
I'll compensate for this lack of courage when the conditions are better. I'll start living authentically when I retire, or when the kids are grown, or when the mortgage is paid off.
Those promises sound so reasonable when death is far away.
But they are hollow and deceitful when death is certain. The future is an evasion.
So the test for any daily activity, no matter how small, becomes, is this action worth carrying with me to the final stretch of my life?
And if the answer is no, you have only two responsible options. Change the action immediately, or accept the full moral cost of continuing that action, but do not deceive yourself about its value.
We also have to be wary of the chaotic extreme.
Right. Some people, when faced with mortality, interpret this as an instruction to destroy their current life, live fast, consume experiences, and burn out quickly.
But Dostoevsky found this path just leads to a deeper, more profound, and violent emptiness than the cautious life of the bureaucrat.
It's still avoidance, just dressed up as recklessness.
So organizing life around death means finding an equilibrium of living enough. Enough commitment to your truth, enough honesty in your relationships, enough humility to know you won't solve every mystery.
And enough patience to live in the tension between meaning and meaninglessness without running away. It doesn't make you frantic or desperate. It transforms you into someone who no longer dares to live carelessly.
We arrive then at the conclusion of Dostoevsky's challenging framework. He offers no soft salvation, no guarantee of comfort, or a painless passing.
No. Death does not grant rewards for a life well lived. Its function, Dostoevsky insists, is simply to expose.
It reveals how we lived when no one, not society, not our parents, not our internal controls, was forcing us to look.
The ultimate achievement, the final promised land, is simply the ability not to turn away when the final moment approaches. A life rigorously organized around death doesn't enter the end with sudden certainty or miraculous peace. It enters with familiarity.
Familiarity with the truth.
Yes, familiarity with living continuously in death's clarifying light.
They don't utter that panicked, agonizing phrase, "if only I had." Not because they were morally perfect, but because they have been living with that question since they first accepted existential responsibility.
They've already acknowledged the weight of every compromise, every choice, and every failure. They're not surprised by their own life.
This is ultimate honesty, directed entirely toward that core, inescapable question that only they can answer. Is this truly the life I am ready to call mine?
That final stance, the ability to look at one's entire history without flinching, that is the ultimate payoff of the hard work of existential responsibility.
And Dostoevsky's promised land does not eliminate the pain of existence. He doesn't believe in a pain-free life.
Not at all. But this process allows people to carry that unavoidable pain as a meaningful part of existence, rather than as a senseless, frustrating accident that ruined their plans.
This life may be solitary, it may be difficult to share or categorize, and it is certainly unsuited for social media slogans.
But it possesses a rare, profound quality. It does not betray itself when it is fundamentally challenged.
He believed the most terrifying thing a person can face is not the moment of physical death, but death arriving and asking with this profound, indifferent clarity, is this all there was?
And the final promised land is where one can answer that terrifying question, not with hurried false words, but with the entire structure of their consciously lived life.
No, this was a life chosen, weighed, and lived.
Imperfect, absolutely unclean, certainly not heroic by social standards, but critically not fake.
For Dostoevsky, this conscious, truthful, living, choosing responsibility over comfort is the only form of salvation, validation, or meaning we can ultimately grant ourselves. You need a life that requires no hiding place from the gaze of truth. We have completed a deep and intentionally challenging dive today. Dostoevsky demands a radical shift, moving away from a life organized around the illusion of control and clever evasion to one centered entirely on the non-negotiable weight of our individual existential responsibility.
And if there's one profound, complex insight to hold on to, it is this. The most serious human evasion of death is often achieved through the most serious of lives. The people most consumed by borrowed morality, optimized efficiency, and relentless busyness are often merely delaying the vital question until it is truly too late to act upon the answer.
So, as you integrate this demanding philosophy back into your own routines and ambitions, here is the final provocative thought Dostoevsky poses for you to mull over. He doesn't ask how long you lived, but whether you lived as if this life was truly your own, chosen, and accepted. If death came as your fairest witness, what would it see when it looked at the conscious inner structure of your life?
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll see you next time.